Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. And I'll rely on you, Charles, for to take us through the presentation. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. I don't have a corporate slide for Zitamar News, but we are an English language news service focused on Mozambique since the end of 2015. I lived in Mozambique from September 2014. I arrived in time to cover that year's presidential and general elections. Started off as Bloomberg's correspondent in the country, then set up Zitamar News with Leigh Elston, my wife and business partner. And we produce a daily newsletter about Mozambique and also publish our own breaking news on the country. We serve an audience of multinational companies, diplomatic missions. We had a particular focus, have had a particular focus on the extractive sector. And Zitamar News continues. I'm no longer in Mozambique. We may touch on that later. I was forced to leave the country just over a week ago, so I'm now coming to you from France rather than Maputo as it was initially intended. But Zitamar continues to cover the business, politics, and economy of Mozambique, and also in particular the Cabo Delgado conflict, where we are partners with ACLED on the Cabo Ligado project, the conflict observatory. Okay, so Charles, should we have the next slide, even the next one? So to set the scene, no, back one, please. Yeah. Scene setting. There we are. So Mozambique is now in a year into the second term of the Filipe Nyusi presidency. Ought to be his final term. It's a two-term limit, and nobody has served more than that. Mozambique's been independent since 1975. First president was Samora Machel, who died in 86. I think I'm getting the dates right. I haven't made a note of this. When Joaquim Chissano took over. So Chissano was president for a long time, and he took Mozambique into the democratic era, which started in 94, and he served two terms before making way for Armando Guebuza in 2004, 2005. He served two terms, and now it's Filipe Nyusi. The next year, optimistically, or I think it'll probably drag on for more than 12 months, will be when Frelimo needs to decide the succession within the party. Unlike certain other countries in the Southern Africa region, like I say, Mozambique hasn't had a tendency for presidents to go on and on. Frelimo has not given up power and doesn't look like it's going to, but individuals don't hang on to power within Frelimo. So we're now in a stage where that's a big question for Mozambique. Nyusi won a crushing victory in the 2019 elections. It mirrored actually the start of Guebuza's second term. So that seems to be a trend that the Frelimo candidate manages to get this huge result for the start of their second term. It was people who've been watching these things for longer than I have say that it was probably the worst elections we've seen in Mozambique in terms of electoral fraud. And yeah, there were various ways and means used by Frelimo to ensure that it would not face a serious challenge in those elections. But I think it also didn't count on the weakness of the opposition, and we'll come to that as well. Almost since independence, there's been this conflict in central Mozambique with Renamo. A peace agreement was reached in 91, or 92 rather. But it flared up again over the last 5-10 years. But now it's basically run its course. I think Renamo's run its course. It hasn't regenerated itself with younger members, and a peace deal has been reached, which seems to be definitive, but for the fact of the existence of the so-called Renamo military junta, which is having sort of a last hurrah, but most observers think has not got much longer to play out. And then, of course, the other big story in Mozambique is the LNG projects, which have been long delayed. I mean, I think initial expectations were that they'd start producing well before now. In any case, one of them has now, well, two of them, to be fair, have got to final investment decisions, the offshore floating LNG project, and now the Total-owned Mozambique LNG project for Area 1, which was originally Anadarko, now Total. But the benefits the Mozambique feels from these projects will be tempered, in my view, both by the effects of the insurgency going on in Cabo Delgado, which we'll touch on later on, and by the resource curse, which tends to affect poor countries with outsized natural resource endowments, in which I think Mozambique is in line for a fairly acute case of. But Paul will also have a view on that, which he will tell us about. I just saw a question pop up asking about the length of presidential terms. It's 5 years. Charles, can we have the next slide? So let's come back to the question of the presidency. So just to run through some of the main runners and riders to succeed Filipe Nyusi within Frelimo. And almost certainly whoever is the Frelimo candidate will win next time around, unless something dramatic happens between now and then. The front runner, kind of the obvious choice at this point, is José Pacheco. He was agriculture minister under Guebuza. I'm not sure if perhaps even the whole 10 years, at least the whole of his second term, and was reappointed agriculture minister by Filipe Nyusi, and then made foreign minister 2 or 3 years ago. He's previously been a provincial governor of Cabo Delgado and perhaps another province as well. He doesn't have the best reputation among, at least among the international community, the donor community. I think he was in charge of agriculture for a long time, which has long been a underperforming sector compared to its potential. And I do remember the reaction of some Western ambassadors when he was appointed foreign minister. They were fairly aghast, but he's nevertheless, he plays the party game. He doesn't have a clear allegiance in terms of which of the Frelimo bigwigs is his patron. He obviously prospered under Guebuza, but has also managed to avoid being completely identified with that wing, and was obviously kept on by Nyusi, although he's out of a job in this second term, which may or may not mean something. And I'm afraid Frelimo is a rather inscrutable organization, and I can do my best to try and interpret it for you, but the fact that he's currently without a formal job in government, I would at least say does not rule him out as being a serious candidate. Another man in that position is Jaime Monteiro. He was the interior minister in Nyusi's first term, having been a police officer who rose to second in command of the police before that. He is seen as being aligned with Nyusi. He's currently head of the Council of State, which is the council of wise men and women who advise the president. So there's been a number of news stories discrediting Monteiro of late, which is interesting, and I understand is part of an effort to discredit him because he has this fairly strong position in the race for the succession. Let's have a look at the next slide, please, Charles. Luisa Diogo, you don't hear an awful lot about her these days, but she is nevertheless being talked about again as a candidate. She was maybe the best positioned last time around, and was edged out by Nyusi in a pretty opaque, well, everything about Frelimo is opaque, but a pretty opaque selection process in I think they left it as late as 2014. No, it must have been 2013, the year before the elections. She just missed out. She's a former prime minister, also a former finance minister. I think it was as finance minister that she negotiated for the Mozambique's participation in the highly indebted poor countries debt relief program. She's a good reputation for governance. She, like José Pacheco, and I forgot to mention this one, his face is on the screen, is from central Mozambique. And it's now seen as being the turn of central Mozambique to take the presidency. Mozambique is not very starkly divided on tribal lines. It's more meaningful to think about regional divisions, of which there are really three: south, centre, and north. Nyusi is the first northern president, and really the first non-southern president. He's from Cabo Delgado. So it's now the presidency in this sort of unwritten rule, which may not be the most important factor, but nevertheless is a factor, should rotate to central Mozambique now. So Diogo would fit that definition, as would José Pacheco. Samora Machel Jr., or also known as Samito, is an interesting prospect. So he, in 2018, he tried to run for the mayoralty of Maputo, which is quite a big and high-profile job, as you imagine. He didn't get the Frelimo candidacy, so he then started running as an independent, which you can't actually do. So he then had to be sponsored by an electoral list, which was come up with in a rush, and they put together a list of candidates. But they were ruled out of the election by the electoral authorities, probably unfairly. And I think that the determination to get him out of the race for the Maputo mayoralty shows what a serious challenger he could be. He's the son of the first president of Mozambique, Samora Machel Senior, well, just Samora Machel. That's a legacy which would certainly work in his favor among the electorate who hark back to the days of Samora immediately after independence, which were good and bad, but I suppose you can look back with rose-tinted spectacles now. So he should not be ruled out at this stage, and it is still early days, and I think we'll see candidates emerge who are also not on my list at all. But we've got one more page of this. Celso Correa, the current agriculture minister, seen as the most powerful minister in Nyusi's government, and really Nyusi's right-hand man. I believe he wanted to be prime minister in the current government, or at least finance minister, and I think Nyusi wanted to give him one of those posts, but was blocked from doing so by the Frelimo Political Commission. Correa is highly ambitious, but it's unclear if his ambitions do run as far as running for president next time around. And I've had it suggested to me that the talk of him wanting to run for president is a device to discredit him, as saying, look at this young upstart, he's so ambitious. Nevertheless, he's on my list, and I think it would be foolish to rule him out at this stage as well. The final possibility I've got down here is whether Nyusi could go for a third term. I think it's unlikely. There was talk of Guebuza wanting to do this. I think Guebuza would have liked to have done it. Nyusi, I'm sure, would like to do it, but I don't think he has the weight within Frelimo to get away with that. But one factor we should perhaps think about is that if the insurgency in the north really gets out of hand, you could see a state of emergency being brought in, which could conceivably, one could imagine, lead to postponement of elections and so on. Okay, let's move on to the opposition. So the elections in 2018, 2019 were very disappointing for both main opposition parties, which are Renamo, the group which started out as a guerrilla group in the 70s and fought a civil war against the Frelimo government until the early 90s, led by Afonso Dhlakama from 1979 up until May, I forget whether it's 2018 or 2019, sorry about that. I think it was 2019, wasn't it? So it's now led by Souf Mohamed, who is not the same as Afonso Dhlakama, much less charismatic, and does not have the sort of unconditional support of his whole party that Djamena did have, at least by the end, and I think probably most of the way through his leadership of Renamo. One thing Djamena had achieved in his latest round of peace negotiations with the government is that the governors of provinces would be elected. Now, the significance of that gain had already been diluted by the fact that the presidency, which up until 2019 had appointed provincial governors, retained the right to appoint provincial secretaries of state alongside the governor. Nevertheless, there was this opportunity for opposition parties to win governorships, and they didn't win a single one in the elections in 2019. I don't know if that was Frelimo's plan. I think most observers assumed that the opposition were going to be thrown a bone in the shape of one or two of these provincial governorships, particularly as they've been made relatively powerless positions anyway. But what happened in the event was they didn't win a single one. Assouf Mohammed was largely blamed within the party for having run a poor election campaign. I mean, as well as the fact that Frelimo had run a dirty tricks campaign, but Mohammed did get some of the blame, and I would not be surprised to see him replaced as the leader of Renamo before the next elections. But there's not a clear roadmap to how that happens. Renamo doesn't have regular congresses. It had one in January 2019, so I beg pardon, so Djamena must have died 2018. January 2019 was when Mohammed was definitively elected president of Renamo, but Renamo won't necessarily have another congress during this presidential term. So I think if he is going to be replaced as the leader of Renamo, there's going to have to be some internal campaign to remove him. And it's not clear how that happens, but nevertheless, there is significant discontent within the party with him as a leader. Point 4, so we're improvising on the hoof here a bit. So David Samanga was the leader of the MDM until he died on Monday. He was the mayor of Beira, which he was first elected to under a Renamo coalition party, but then he left Renamo when he wasn't allowed to run again in 2008 to run Beira. And he set up the MDM and has been a significant figure on the political scene until his untimely death this week. I think he was trying to position himself to unite Renamo and the MDM and take over from Assouf Mohammed, which would have been a tall order in any case. But his death, I think, is a real reverse for the chances of Mozambican democracy, which is already seriously in the doldrums. But it remains to be seen if and how the MDM continues without him, or whether his disappearance clears the space for another actor or even another movement to come on the scene. In the immediate term, though, I mean, I think it really clears the way, removes any doubt, if there was any, of that Frelimo will have a pretty clear run at the next elections. Yeah, thanks, Charles. The conflict in central Mozambique. So militarily, Renamo is now really a spent force. The appearance of the military junta under General Mariano Nyong'o was, I suppose, fairly predictable, that there would be an element within Renamo that was unhappy with the peace deal. But again, it's a small band of aging guerrillas which are not really going to offer a sustained threat. And they're actually more and more senior members of it are joining the demilitarization, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration program, which is being supported by the international community as well at the moment. However, to my third point there, I mean, I think this doesn't mean that the people of central Mozambique are necessarily going to be happy with the continued Frelimo hegemony. And I don't know how that discontentment is going to manifest itself going forward. But I think as long as there is not meaningful democracy, I think peace and stability in central Mozambique can't really be counted on. Meanwhile, there's a conflict now in the north, in Cabo Delgado, which is different, but I think has important parallels. It's so when the Renamo insurgency came up in the second half of the 1970s, it was sponsored first by Rhodesia and then by apartheid South Africa. But nevertheless, it does have to be accepted that Renamo was also a local movement. And I think that dichotomy is also present in Cabo Delgado, where it can be seen as an extension of the Islamic State trying to gain territory across the world, but it's also growing up out of local discontent in Cabo Delgado, where people are frustrated at continued underdevelopment, lack of development. And also in a context of essentially a one-party state which isn't acting in the interest of its people. Longer term solution, like I say, decentralization has largely failed in terms of the provincial governors. I wonder whether a longer term, more sustainable solution would have to be meaningful devolution of power, perhaps on a regional basis, as mentioned before, to the central and northern regions. Let's have a look at the next slide. Keep my notes keeping up as well. Okay, so a quick rundown of the hidden debts, which has become a shorthand for this scandal of, in the second term of Guebuza, the Guebuza administration, the Secret Services ordered $2 billion worth of offshore security equipment from Privinvest, a Lebanese-held group. The money was raised through Credit Suisse and VTB in London and went straight to Privinvest. None of it came into Mozambique, but it was raised with government guarantees. The projects failed for reasons I won't go into now. There are court cases ongoing, and Mozambique is claiming that it's not liable for debts which its then Finance Minister Manuel Chang signed guarantees for. The guarantees were illegal under Mozambican law. They've been ruled unconstitutional by the Constitutional Council. Manuel Chang is wanted in New York and in Maputo, and is in jail in, I think it's Pretoria, or just outside Joburg, excuse me, where he was arrested Christmas 2018 as well. And so there are competing extradition claims from Mozambique and the US. A trial went ahead in the US without Chang being there, of Jean Bustani of Privinvest, who was acquitted of the financial crimes that he was put on trial of, but lots of evidence came out that there had been payments made to Mozambican officials, particularly those around President Guebuza, although President Guebuza himself has managed to keep his hands relatively clean, it seems. There are now cases going on in London about who's liable for the debts. Mozambique is suing Privinvest and suing Credit Suisse, who are countersuing. Privinvest's tactic at the moment is to emphasize the role of Philippe Nyusi, who was defense minister at the time, in putting these deals together, because it was Secret Services and defense ministry owned companies that borrowed all the money. It seems to be a tactic to, my guess is that by bringing the current president into it, they want Mozambique to call a halt to their actions in London, but we'll see. In terms of a domestic political penalty, I mean, the 2019 election suggests that really the electorate got over it. and I think the donor community, who were shocked at the time when all the details came out in 2016, they've also taken the view that they can't keep punishing Mozambique indefinitely for this. But the big question remains, perhaps from the view of bondholders at least, whether Mozambique will remain on the hook for the debts. Some of them have been repackaged as a sovereign bond, which Mozambique is not trying to, which Mozambique says it will honour, although it's restructured it to put it a fair distance into the future. But there are two other debts which were syndicated loans, which Mozambique is arguing which it doesn't have to pay. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so 2017, there was an attack on the town of Mocimboa da Praia, which really came as a surprise to everyone. With the benefit of hindsight, there had been a growth in hardline Islamist sects in the province of Cabo Delgado, which is the northeastern province of Mozambique, where the gas projects are located. But I think nobody could say they weren't surprised by the attack on Mocimboa da Praia, which is a small port town in Cabo Delgado. That was then the start of what has become this insurgency in Cabo Delgado, which has grown in intensity, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months. Over the last couple of months, the government has shown signs of starting to get a handle on it. It was really out of control for a long time. The town of Mocimboa da Praia was taken last July, August by the insurgents, and remains out of the government's control. Nevertheless, it does seem that the government is turning the tide with the help of private military contractors or mercenaries whom it's engaged. But and Mozambique is talking to various international partners about how they can help as well. Portugal are sending military trainers. I believe the UK have offered. France, I think, is ready to have a role, particularly given Total's involvement in the LNG projects. But Mozambique hasn't brought them in yet. I think it's very sensitive about any suggestion of ceding sovereignty. But despite a recent trend towards getting a handle on things, I think Mozambique does need help, international help. One of the aspects of the insurgency is that it threatens the LNG projects, which are being built up on or one of which is being built up on the Afungi Peninsula. To some extent, and perhaps Paul will elaborate on this a bit as well, it isn't necessarily dependent on security in the rest of the province because it's on the coast. I mean, it's a coastal liquefaction project for offshore gas, so it can be supplied offshore to some extent. But it has definitely been hampered by the lack of road access over the last year. And port infrastructure around the project still needs to be built. Total are now apparently demanding a security cordon around the projects, and have put together a joint task force with Mozambican military and police to protect the projects. But the development, how this insurgency develops, will certainly have an impact on how fast and even whether the projects can go ahead. The LNG projects, there are supposed to be 2 onshore LNG projects. One of them is past final investment decision, Total's one, but the ExxonMobil-led Area 4 project is yet to make a decision. So that remains uncertain. Okay, next slide, please, Charles. Paul is going to cover the economy for us, so I thought I'd just bring out a couple of points that I thought were worth making, but perhaps he'll make as well, or from a different angle. So Mozambique has been a nice place to be in 2020 relative to most of the world. As I was telling Emma, we didn't have a lockdown. the government realized that it's the socio-economic realities of Mozambique means that people simply wouldn't survive if they had to stay home. But we seem to have got away with it as well, COVID-wise. And as we were chatting before we opened the webinar, demographics is probably a big part of that. Lack of obesity. But yeah, Mozambique managed to keep it under control. This Christmas Mozambique opened the borders for the sake of the tourism industry, just as the South African strain was becoming particularly prevalent in South Africa. And so now Mozambique is having what you might call a second wave, but it's really Mozambique's first significant wave of COVID. But nevertheless, in global terms, numbers are still pretty low, and Mozambique remains not locked down. Maputo now has a curfew for the first time, which starts at 9 p.m., runs from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. Okay, but anyway, there are big issues for the economy to face up to. Vale and Mitsui have said they're selling out of their coal projects in Tet. Maybe they'll sell to a Chinese or an Indian miner, but nevertheless, it seems like that sector is in terminal decline. The other big export commodity has been aluminium through the Mozal smelter. But I think dynamics in the Southern African power market means that might also become unsustainable as contracts, long-term offtake contracts from the Cahorabassa hydroelectric dam come up for revision with South African Eskom and so on. The other sector, which I think, like I alluded to earlier on, ought to be doing much better than it is agriculture. We now have Minister Celso Correa in place, who is probably doing a better job than José Pacheco did. But nevertheless, it really remains to be seen whether we'll get anywhere near to realizing the potential that Mozambique has for agriculture. So if other exports are in decline, LNG could end up really being the only game in town export-wise. Although I should mention some other mining exports, heavy sands, graphite, rubies, and I think gold is also going to be a growing sector. But we're looking at a resource export-dominated economy with a big threat of Dutch disease overvaluing the currency, which would make life even harder for agriculture. There's talk of a sovereign wealth fund, but I'm not particularly impressed with the plans so far for the design of it, particularly insofar as it's going to try and mitigate some of the effects that the dominant effect of LNG will have on the rest of the economy. And that's about that for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'll stop sharing now. And now, Paul, if you can share your screen, please. Okay.
Good afternoon. How's the volume?
Fine.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Paul Eardley-Taylor for Standard Bank. I look after Southern Africa oil and gas for the bank, and with a particular focus on Mozambique since about 2012, 2013. Very brief word on Standard Bank in Mozambique. We were the first commercial bank to start operations in the country way back in 1894. And for some time, we've been the leading corporate investment bank in Mozambique, and very much have been at the forefront of LNG discussions within country and economic development of the overall value chain of LNG and how it will transform the lives of Mozambicans. And touching on the LNG itself, some of the things the bank has done, we've written a number of economic studies on the impact of the LNG, all of which I've led. One for Anadarko, which delivered the decree law in 2014, one for Shell on domestic gas and one for ExxonMobil on Rovuma LNG in 2019. And touching on the topic of the resource curse straight away, it's important to recognize that as it stands today, there is no such thing as a gas curse. The resource curses that have been mentioned are in the mining sector and the oil sector, but there hasn't yet been one in LNG. And what we would say is that the judgment on whether Mozambique has a resource curse or not is not really going to be known until the 2030s. And I'll take you through some of the reasons why. In addition to studies, we've also done a lot of banking, and we've been one of the largest lenders to Mozambique LNG, and as well as Coral previously before that. And the issue of economic development is absolutely crucial to Mozambique. So at the moment, Mozambique's GDP per capita is about $504. If you pick a random European country, let's use the example of Sweden, the average GDP per capita is about $54,000. So that really gives you a flavor of where Mozambique is. As Charles mentioned, Fauzi can't be with us today, so I'll do the economics briefly. In essence, Mozambique's economic situation is fairly predictable. You have what is established as one of the poorer countries in Africa and indeed the world. It has been affected by COVID, not on a human level as such, as has been mentioned by Tom, but certainly from an economic point of view. Inflation is increasing, interest rates, which are already high, have been increased further to combat inflation. The sense that we have from a GDP point of view is it's only really the completion of the Coral FLNG project, which is probably going to be the third, fourth quarter next year, that will start to lift Mozambique's GDP up. And then once Mozambique LNG is complete during 2024, then you'll have takeoff. At the moment, inflation I've talked about, foreign exchange reserves are still reasonably robust. That's because of capital gains proceeds that have been received over time from the periodic farm downs and the acquisitions. Mozambique's current account deficit is enormous at the moment by the LNG projects that are self-funding. Sovereign debt has been mentioned. Mozambique's sovereign debt is extremely high. It's roughly about 100% of GDP, $15 billion. And actually, in some ways, that's actually quite reassuring and resource scarce, because in essence, there's an awful lot of sovereign debt to repay through the 2020s before a sovereign wealth fund really is required at the back end of the 2020s. And in terms of agriculture, as has been mentioned, Mozambique is fantastically agrarian. In terms of either the share of the labor force, around about 70%, and in terms of absolute GDP, about 22%. And one of the crucial areas of government focus, once the security situation has moved on, is really to make sure that Cabo Delgado can become the breadbasket of Mozambique from the LNG point of view. So turning to the LNG itself, it's a very quick geography lesson that is worthwhile. From an LNG perspective, the world of LNG is divided in two. You have the Atlantic Basin, which is roughly about 30% of global demand, highly competitive, lots of piped gas options. And then you have the Pacific Basin. These are the large economies of Asia Pacific, round about 70% of world LNG demand and growing. And Mozambique's unique geographical position, the second longest coastline in Africa, really enables Mozambique to serve either market equally well. So its primary customers will be the Pacific Basin, but it is also able to serve Europe equally well. And in terms of LNG demand, one of the points, especially in the London market, that pops up a lot is the energy transition and do we see a death of the hydrocarbons or a decline of hydrocarbons? Not in the case of LNG. What is significant last year, despite COVID, where oil demand globally dropped about 9%, was that LNG demand actually went up by 2–3%. So you had a real delta with the oil industry. And that growth is projected to continue as far out as 2040 and beyond. What we tend to do is we update our own aggregation of projections every time a new one is published. Shell comes out tomorrow, probably ExxonMobil last week. And if you look ahead, you see the demand is, broadly speaking, going to increase about 3% per annum up to 2040. And the key reason for this is the drive towards cleaner energy in the world, and in particular, coal to gas switching in the power sectors. So what are Mozambique's advantages? I've mentioned the geography already. I've mentioned the cleaner energy. In addition, Mozambique is politically non-aligned. Everybody is able to buy from Mozambique. There's no such concept of trade wars, or no likely to be a concept of trade wars. In addition, the gas is essentially located in a single place. It's more or less a giant puddle in offshore Cabo Delgado that occupies a lot less space than London's M25. And lastly, Mozambique itself has a very practical approach to developing the LNG projects. And its real ideology is pragmatism and a market awareness of the need to develop the LNG. So if I give you an example of how we argue that Mozambique is really a force for good in the world of cleaner energy, probably the single best example I can give you is India. It's only 7 days one-way sailing distance between Mozambique and India. India is the #3 emitter of CO2 by country on planet Earth after the US and China. India is aiming to reduce its emissions by 33% to 2030. How is it going to do that? One of the key reasons, as well as renewables, is natural gas. And I show on the screen there a picture from Shell's financial results last week, who are very clear on the role that LNG delivered into Western India will play into decarbonising India. So from that perspective, Mozambique is absolutely a force for good in terms of creating cleaner energy in Asia Pacific and ultimately reducing the growth of CO2 emissions. So we turn on to the projects themselves. When I do these webinars or conferences, I always like to say I was born to work on Mozambique because the country itself is only 29 days older than myself. What is important though is not just it's an LNG story, but you also have an existing gas play story, which is the Sasol production since 2004. Literally just this week, Sasol announced the FID of their second onshore gas scheme. So that's very much an industry that's continuing to have a future. And in terms of the future, next year, Mozambique will drill its exploration wells for the 5th licensing round. This has been delayed due to COVID. And then hopefully there will also be a 6th licensing round launched in the near future, and hopefully which will be executed before 2025, where a couple of the IOCs have got cutoffs for exploration. In terms of the documentation, Mozambique's documentation is absolutely world-class. It was designed by consultants when it was bid in 2005. You have very rigorous laid out timetables. You have very rigorous taxation provisions, which on the whole allow the government a higher fiscal share than many other taxation provisions around the world for gas. That's been proven by the likes of Wood Mackenzie. And in our own studies, we worked out that Mozambique has a tax take over time of between 62 and 66%. And in essence, the grand bargain is that the companies accepted the documentation as is, and in return, they simply asked for a law called the Decree Law, which allows the LNG projects to raise project financing along the lines of a Qatari LNG scheme. So turning on to the projects, just to pick Tom up on one of the points that was mentioned, Mozambique has not actually been slow in developing the LNG projects. If you look at Coral took FID within 6 years of its first discoveries in 2011. That is extremely fast by world standards. And it was also the world's first project finance floating LNG scheme. Mozambique LNG was Anadarko, now being managed by Total. That is publicly announced by Total recently in their results, has been on time and to budget and scheduled for 2024. The interesting topic, which will really come through in the next couple of years, is whether there will be unitization. So I've mentioned that Mozambique has these enormous gas fields that are essentially a large puddle and half the size of the M25. Contractually, the documents do not reflect the physical reality. So about 86 trillion cubic feet is unitized physically, but the documents only allow for 24 at this stage. So one of the key discussion points over the next couple of years will be, will unitization go ahead, and then ultimately allow a real cost reduction in terms of Mozambique's development, so it can absolutely compete for the long term. And then the second theme to just pick up, and really we're in February 2021, is by the end of December 2023, the projects have to put down overall plans for the entire 150 TCF. This will be interesting to see how aggressive they're looking to go over the long term, and whether Mozambique can get to the 90 million tons or so that Standard Bank hopes it can. So this is the country hypothesis we laid down. Essentially, Coral is expected to reach commercial operations during the fourth quarter of next year. And after that, it's broadly about a 2-year window between the completion of individual LNG projects. And again, it's important to mention the resource curse. So what is likely to happen in the 2020s? First of all, you can't have a resource curse until you actually have the generation and production of the resources. So that's going to occur from 22 onwards, with a real uptick from 24 onwards. You also have the need to amortize the costs that have been incurred in producing those resources. So for at least the first few years afterwards, there'll be a need to repay the cost of the projects. There'll also be a need to repay the sovereign debt that was mentioned earlier. And it's only really the 2030s where Mozambique will absolutely boom from the LNG production. And the analogy here is really along Qatari lines, where Qatar's first LNG production was 1996, but it was only really the later noughties and the early teens where Qatar really exploded into being the economic powerhouse it is today. This is our schematic of where we see the projects are. We reckon there's $120 billion of FIDs to be put in by 2026. Roughly at the moment, the sunk investments into Mozambique is about $50 to $55 billion. And what one almost must bear in mind is the mergers and acquisition values, which are about $17 billion that have been paid simply for the rights to invest in, explore, and then produce Mozambique LNG. So that $17 billion has to be added to the 120. So in effect, you have about $140 billion plus minus of funds to be committed to Mozambique's gas sector by about 2026. And then just a brief word on the regional implications. Mozambique, as I've mentioned, is an enormously long country, about 2,600 kilometers. From Standard Bank's point of view, we expect a series of coastal developments, a mini Australia, a mini China, where you'll have the coastal towns being quite prosperous. It's going to be absolutely crucial to make the hinterland, the agricultural breadbasket, to make sure that that benefits from infrastructure, to make sure that the Mozambican population benefit from access to electricity. So here we see things like photovoltaic solar, off-grid generation, batteries, as really playing a role in terms of increasing individual empowerment and wealth inland. And what we're seeing at the moment, and this is the real start of a theme that's going to accelerate probably this year and beyond, is Mozambique's LNG and gas is starting to affect South Africa for the first time. So South Africa has been reasonably slow in terms of involvement in Mozambique, despite the linkages and despite the holiday destinations and so on. But what you have now is it's public domain that Sasol is looking to dispose of some of its infrastructure stakes. Romco, the pipeline between SA and Mozambique, had a timeline committed at Sasol's results this week. It's also public domain that a Mozambican company, Gigajoule and Total, are looking to develop a floating storage and regasification terminal. That's the green ship at the bottom in Matola next to Maputo. That is expected to supply gas through regasified LNG to South Africa. And it's also public domain that ExxonMobil and Vopak are looking at a feasibility study to import LNG into South Africa as well. So what we're starting to see is the same trend of cleaner energy in Asia Pacific, coal to gas switching, is moving inexorably towards South Africa. And if you see here on the schematic, this is essentially the gas transmission and distribution network in South Africa. and the green squares are coal-fired power stations, which are fairly old, fairly dirty, pump out a lot of SOx, NOx, ash, consume a lot of water, and also have community health issues. It is likely that those power stations will be replaced in the next few years by combined cycle gas turbines, which emit roughly 40% of the CO2 and don't have any of the other detriments, ash, water consumption, and so on. So we expect these to be eligible for climate financing to really undertake a rebalancing of Eskom's power fleet, whereby a combination of CCGT and renewables will help bring South Africa's energy security and cleaner energy. And then lastly, just to finish off, I'm going to go north. So the overall region of essentially northern Kenya, swinging all the way around to South Africa, which is kind of the ambit of Mozambique's African influence, has a population of about 250 million people. And of those 250 million people, round about 150 million are in East Africa itself. What we can see over time, and this is partly linked to the ACFTA, which has been introduced now, are increasing energy and economic linkages between Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. This is going to take time, but we see Mombasa buying some LNG from Mozambique. It is only 1,000 kilometers, unbelievably low cost shipping. We also see the possibility of joining together Tanzania's resources of around about 30 to 50 TCF with Mozambique's 150 TCF, especially as in that case, you already have a coastal pipeline that's half built in Tanzania. And then lastly, we expect once the Ugandan FID of oil takes place this year, there may well be starts of discussions around bringing natural gas into Uganda. So in summary, I'll stop there. From our perspective, Mozambique is very much a core country to promote cleaner energy, especially to Asia Pacific, but then also in increasing volumes over the next few years to Africa. And from a developmental perspective, with a GDP per capita of about $500, the opportunity of investing $120 billion into Mozambique will hopefully lead to the upliftment of Mozambicans from the mid-2020s onwards and beyond. Thank you very much.